Putin and Niger Nuclear Deal Story. Part 1. The scorching heat of Niamey, Niger's capital, beat down mercilessly as President Mohamed Bazoum walked through the presidential palace corridors. His mind raced with thoughts of his nation's future, weighing the consequences of decisions that would reshape West Africa's geopolitical landscape forever. Little did he know that across the globe, Vladimir Putin was already 3 steps ahead in a chess game that would topple France's century-old grip on African resources. Niger had been France's golden goose for decades. Hidden beneath the desert sands lay some of the world's richest uranium deposits, feeding France's nuclear power plants and keeping the lights on in Paris, Lyon, and Marseille. The French mining giant Areva, later renamed Orano, had been extracting this precious resource since the 1970s. Paying Niger pennies on the dollar while generating billions in revenue for French coffers. The relationship wasn't partnership. It was exploitation dressed in diplomatic language. President Bazoum understood this bitter reality all too well. His country remained one of the world's poorest, despite sitting atop treasure troves of uranium. The French had built their energy independence on Niger's resources, while Nigerians lived without reliable electricity, clean water, or proper health care. The irony was suffocating. A nation powering Europe while its own people remained in darkness. Meanwhile, in Moscow's ornate halls of power, Vladimir Putin studied intelligence reports about French vulnerabilities in Africa. His advisors had identified a golden opportunity. France's energy security depended heavily on uranium imports from Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso. If Russia could disrupt this supply chain, it would deliver a devastating blow to French energy independence while expanding Russian influence across the Sahel region. Putin's strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. Rather than military intervention or economic sanctions, he would offer African nations what France never did: genuine partnership, technology transfer, and fair compensation for their resources. The Russian president knew that decades of French colonial mentality had created deep resentment among African leaders. He would exploit this frustration masterfully. The first overtures came through diplomatic channels. Russian ambassadors across West Africa began hosting intimate dinners with government ministers, business leaders, and military officials. The conversations were subtle but pointed. Russia could offer nuclear technology, training, and most importantly, respect for African sovereignty. Unlike France, Russia wouldn't interfere in domestic politics or maintain military bases as tools of control. President Bazoum received his first formal invitation to visit Moscow in early 2023. The timing was perfect. Niger was facing increasing pressure from jihadist groups in the region, and French military assistance had proven inadequate. The French forces seemed more interested in protecting mining facilities than Nigerian civilians. Public sentiment was turning against the French presence, with protesters regularly demanding their departure. The Russian proposal was enticing. Putin's representatives offered to build a modern nuclear research facility in Niger, complete with training programs for Nigerian scientists and engineers. They promised to purchase uranium at market prices, not the below-market rates France had been paying for decades. Most importantly, they offered military cooperation and security assistance without the condescending attitude that characterized French interactions. Bazoum found himself caught between two worlds. He understood that accepting Russian assistance would trigger severe retaliation from France and its Western allies. French President Emmanuel Macron had made it clear that France considered its African partnerships non-negotiable. The French military maintained bases across the Sahel region, specifically to protect these economic interests. Any attempt to diversify partnerships would be seen as betrayal. However, the Nigerian president also recognized that his country's future depended on breaking free from French economic colonialism. The uranium wealth should benefit Niger's people, not French shareholders. Russian partnership offered a pathway to genuine development and technological advancement. The choice was between continued servitude and uncertain independence. The first secret meeting between Niger and Russian officials took place in Dubai, away from prying French intelligence services. The Russian delegation was led by Alexei Miller, head of Gazprom, and several nuclear energy experts. They presented detailed plans for nuclear cooperation that went far beyond simple resource extraction. Russia offered to build uranium enrichment facilities in Niger, creating high-value jobs and keeping more wealth within the country. The French intelligence services weren't blind to these developments. Reports began flowing into Paris about increased Russian diplomatic activity across West Africa. Macron's advisors warned him about the potential consequences of losing Niger's uranium supplies. France's nuclear power plants generated about 70% of the country's electricity. Losing access to cheap African uranium would force France to purchase expensive supplies on international markets, dramatically increasing energy costs for French consumers. Macron responded predictably, dispatching high-ranking officials to Niamey with promises of increased aid and investment. But these were empty gestures that came too late. The French had decades to treat Niger as an equal partner, but instead maintained their colonial mindset. They offered small increases in uranium prices and token infrastructure projects while demanding continued exclusive access to Niger's resources. The Russian approach was fundamentally different. They didn't see Niger as a source of cheap raw materials, but as a potential strategic partner in a multipolar world. Putin understood that winning African hearts and minds required showing genuine respect for African sovereignty and offering mutually beneficial relationships. This philosophical difference would prove decisive in the coming negotiations. As 2023 progressed, the situation in Niger became increasingly unstable. Public protests against French presence intensified, with demonstrators burning French flags and demanding the closure of military bases. The Nigerian military grew restless, frustrated with French interference in national affairs. Young officers began questioning why Niger should remain subservient to a former colonial power that showed little respect for Nigerian interests. President Bazoum found himself walking a tightrope. He needed to satisfy growing anti-French sentiment while avoiding actions that might provoke French retaliation. The uranium contracts with France were scheduled for renewal in 2024, providing a natural opportunity to renegotiate terms or explore alternative partnerships. The stage was set for a confrontation that would reshape West African geopolitics. Putin sensed the moment was right to make his move. He had successfully identified France's Achilles heel and positioned Russia as a credible alternative partner for African nations seeking genuine independence. The nuclear deal with Niger would be just the beginning of a broader strategy to diminish French influence across Africa while expanding Russian presence in strategically important regions. The chess pieces were in position. The game was about to begin. The phone rang at 3 a.m. in the Élysée Palace, jolting President Emmanuel Macron from his sleep. The voice on the other end belonged to his chief intelligence advisor, delivering news that would send shockwaves through French political circles. Mr. President, we have a problem in Niger. Our sources confirm that President Bazoum has been overthrown by military coup. The new leadership is demanding immediate French withdrawal. Macron rubbed his eyes, trying to process the implications. The coup in Niger wasn't just another African political upheaval. It was a catastrophic blow to France's energy security and global influence. The timing seemed too convenient to be coincidental. Russian fingerprints were all over this development, though proving direct involvement would be nearly impossible. Colonel Abdurrahmane Chiani, the coup leader, appeared on national television within hours of seizing power. His message was clear and defiant. Niger would no longer tolerate foreign exploitation of its resources. The uranium contracts with French companies were suspended pending review. All French military personnel had 30 days to leave Nigerian territory. The colonel's words echoed across West Africa, inspiring similar sentiments in neighboring countries still under French influence. In Moscow, Vladimir Putin watched the Niger developments with satisfaction. His patient strategy was bearing fruit faster than expected. The coup wasn't directly orchestrated by Russia, but years of careful diplomatic groundwork had created conditions for such upheaval. Russian military advisors operating under the Wagner Group banner had been building relationships with disgruntled African military officers across the Sahel region. These connections proved invaluable when the time came for change. The new Nigerian military government wasted no time in reaching out to Russian representatives. Within 48 hours of the coup, a high-level delegation was on its way to Moscow for emergency talks. The Russians welcomed them with open arms, offering immediate recognition and support. This swift diplomatic response contrasted sharply with Western hesitation and condemnation of the coup. French mining executives at Orano watched their stock prices plummet as news of the Niger crisis spread. The company's mines in Niger produced about 20% of the uranium used in French nuclear power plants. Losing access to these deposits would force France to source uranium from more expensive suppliers like Kazakhstan, Australia, or Canada. The immediate impact on French energy costs would be devastating, with electricity prices potentially doubling within months. Macron convened an emergency cabinet meeting to address the crisis. Defense Minister Sébastien Lecornu argued for military intervention to restore the ousted president and protect French interests. Foreign Minister Catherine Colonna advocated for diplomatic pressure through international organizations. Finance Minister Bruno Le Maire warned about the economic catastrophe facing France if uranium supplies were permanently cut off. The French president faced an impossible choice. Military intervention would risk a wider conflict and international condemnation. Diplomatic pressure had limited effectiveness against a military government that enjoyed popular support. Economic sanctions would be meaningless against a country already among the world's poorest. France's colonial-era toolbox seemed inadequate for this new reality. Meanwhile, the Russian delegation in Niger was making remarkable progress. Colonel Chiani and his military council listened intently as Russian officials outlined their vision for partnership. Unlike the French, who spoke down to African leaders with barely concealed condescension, the Russians treated their Nigerian counterparts as equals. The psychological impact of this respectful approach cannot be overstated. The Russian proposal was comprehensive and generous. They offered to purchase Niger's uranium at international market prices, representing a 300% increase from French rates. Russian nuclear engineers would help build processing facilities in Niger, creating thousands of high-skilled jobs and keeping more value-added production within the country. Most importantly, Russia promised non-interference in Niger's internal affairs, a stark contrast to France's interventionist history. Alexander Novak, Russia's deputy prime minister for energy, personally flew to Niamey to finalize preliminary agreements. The symbolism was powerful. A senior Russian official treating Niger as worthy of high-level diplomatic attention. Novak's presence demonstrated Putin's serious commitment to African partnership and challenged the narrative that Russia was merely an opportunistic troublemaker. The preliminary nuclear cooperation agreement signed in Niamey sent shockwaves through European capitals. Beyond the immediate uranium supply crisis, the deal represented a fundamental shift in global power dynamics. For decades, France had used its African relationships to maintain relevance in international affairs. Losing Niger threatened to unravel French influence across the entire Sahel region. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz called Macron to express solidarity, but also concern about European energy security. Germany had already reduced its reliance on Russian gas following the Ukraine conflict. Now France's nuclear energy faced disruption from Russian geopolitical maneuvering. The irony wasn't lost on European leaders. Their attempts to isolate Russia were backfiring spectacularly. The human cost of this geopolitical chess game was becoming apparent in Niger itself. French development aid, which had been modest but steady, was immediately suspended. European Union assistance programs were put on hold, pending assessment of the new government's legitimacy. For ordinary Nigerians who had seen little benefit from uranium wealth, these punitive measures confirmed their suspicions about Western motivations. Russian assistance, by contrast, began flowing almost immediately. Medical supplies, food aid, and security equipment arrived in Niamey within days of the preliminary agreement. Russian military advisors began training Nigerian forces in counterterrorism operations. The speed and efficiency of Russian response impressed even skeptical observers and built goodwill among the population. The regional implications extended far beyond Niger's borders. In Mali and Burkina Faso, where similar military governments had already reduced French presence, the Niger example provided encouragement for further moves toward Russia. Across West Africa, politicians and military officers took note of Russia's respectful treatment of African partners and generous terms for resource partnerships. French military bases across the Sahel suddenly felt vulnerable and isolated. The 1,500 French troops in Niger faced an impossible situation. ordered to remain by Paris but unwelcome by the new government and surrounded by hostile populations. Intelligence reports warned of potential attacks on French facilities by groups sympathetic to the military government. The economic warfare was just beginning. France quietly began pressuring international uranium markets to prevent Niger from finding alternative buyers. French influence in international financial institutions was used to restrict Niger's access to development loans. These punitive measures backfired by pushing Niger further into Russian arms and confirming African suspicions about Western hypocrisy regarding sovereignty and free markets. Putin's strategy was working perfectly. By offering genuine partnership instead of exploitation, Russia was winning African hearts and minds while simultaneously weakening Western influence. The Niger nuclear deal was becoming a template for Russian engagement across Africa, promising fair prices, technology transfer, and respect for sovereignty. As the first month after the coup ended, the full scope of the crisis facing France became clear. Niger's uranium was off the market, French troops were under siege, and Russian influence was expanding rapidly across West Africa. What had begun as a localized political upheaval was morphing into a fundamental challenge to French global position and European energy security. The chess game Putin had initiated was proceeding exactly as planned. The moment of truth arrived on a crisp October morning when Colonel Chiani signed the comprehensive nuclear cooperation agreement with Russian officials in a ceremony broadcast live across Africa. The signing took place not in a government building, but at the site where France's largest uranium mine had operated for decades. The symbolism was unmistakable. Niger was reclaiming control over its natural resources and choosing its own partners. Alexander Novak stood beside the Nigerian leader as cameras captured the historic moment. The agreement's terms were more generous than anyone had expected. Russia would pay Niger 85% of international uranium spot prices, compared to the 15% France had been offering. Russian nuclear engineers would transfer technology for uranium processing, ensuring that Niger would eventually export finished nuclear fuel rather than raw materials. Most remarkably, Russia committed to training 5,000 Nigerian scientists and engineers over the next decade. The immediate aftermath of the signing sent shockwaves through European energy markets. French nuclear power plant operators issued emergency statements assuring consumers that electricity supplies remained secure. But privately, they scrambled to secure alternative uranium sources. Spot uranium prices on international markets spiked by 35% within hours as traders realized that France would need to compete for supplies previously secured through colonial arrangements. Emmanuel Macron convened another crisis meeting at the Élysée Palace, this time including energy executives and military leaders. The discussion was heated and desperate. Defense Minister Lecornu presented military options for retaking Niger's uranium mines, but intelligence assessments warned of catastrophic failure. Russian military advisors had transformed Niger's army into a competent fighting force, while French forces in the region were outnumbered and poorly positioned for offensive operations. The human cost of France's energy crisis began affecting ordinary citizens almost immediately. EDF announced that residential electricity rates would increase by 25% starting in January, with industrial rates rising even higher. French manufacturers began relocating production to countries with more stable energy costs. The competitive advantages that cheap nuclear power had provided French industry for decades were evaporating overnight. Meanwhile, in Niger's capital, the atmosphere was celebratory. Public squares filled with citizens dancing and singing patriotic songs. Street vendors sold T-shirts featuring Russian and Nigerian flags side by side. Children who had grown up seeing French soldiers on their streets now watched Russian engineers teaching their parents new skills. The psychological transformation was as important as the economic one. Niger finally felt like a sovereign nation. The Russian nuclear cooperation program moved into high gear with remarkable speed. Within weeks of the agreement signing, cargo planes began arriving at Niamey's airport carrying sophisticated mining equipment, laboratory instruments, and construction materials. The first group of 200 Nigerian students departed for Moscow to begin nuclear engineering studies at Russian universities. The contrast with French educational programs, which had kept Africans in subordinate technical roles, was stark and intentional. Putin's African strategy gained momentum as other nations sought similar partnerships. Ghana's president quietly reached out to Russian representatives about uranium exploration in the northern regions. Tanzania's leadership expressed interest in Russian nuclear technology for their planned power plants. Even traditionally pro-Western countries like Kenya began reassessing their relationships. With former colonial powers, the geopolitical implications extended beyond Africa as China announced its intention to build a high-speed railway connecting Niger's uranium mines to the Atlantic coast. The Chinese-financed infrastructure would eliminate Niger's dependence on French-controlled transportation networks, creating new export routes through Ghana and Nigeria. This trilateral cooperation between Russia, China, and Niger represented a fundamental challenge to Western economic dominance in Africa. French intelligence services worked frantically to understand and counter Russian influence operations across West Africa. Their reports painted a disturbing picture of systematic Russian penetration into African societies through cultural programs, media outlets, and civil society organizations. Russian-funded radio stations broadcast in local languages, promoting anti-French sentiment while praising Russian partnership models. The military dimension of the crisis deepened when Wagner Group advisors began establishing training camps across the Sahel region. Their expertise in guerrilla warfare and unconventional tactics proved invaluable for African armies facing jihadist insurgencies that French forces had failed to defeat. The effectiveness of Russian military assistance stood in stark contrast to expensive French interventions that had achieved limited results. European Union officials attempted to coordinate a response to the unfolding crisis, but national interests prevented unified action. Italy and Spain, heavily dependent on French nuclear exports, demanded stronger measures against Niger's military government. Germany and Poland, still recovering from the Ukraine-related energy crisis, were reluctant to escalate tensions with Russia. The division weakened European leverage and encouraged further Russian advances. The economic warfare between France and Niger intensified as both sides sought to maximize their advantages. France pressured international banks to restrict Niger's access to foreign currency markets, hoping to create financial difficulties for the new government. Niger responded by demanding that all uranium payments be made in yuan or rubles, further reducing French influence over the transaction process. Russian media coverage of the Niger partnership became a powerful tool for influence throughout Africa. RT Arabic and RT French broadcast detailed reports about Russian infrastructure projects, educational programs, and fair resource agreements. The coverage contrasted sharply with Western media focus on military coups and political instability, presenting Russia as a constructive partner in African development rather than an opportunistic troublemaker. The technological transfer component of the Russian partnership began yielding visible results as Niger's first uranium processing facility broke ground near Arlit. Russian engineers worked alongside Nigerian counterparts, ensuring knowledge transfer rather than simple technological dependence. The facility would eventually produce uranium hexafluoride, the processed form needed for nuclear fuel fabrication, eliminating Niger's need to export raw uranium at minimal prices. French nuclear industry executives watched in horror as their competitive advantages disappeared. For decades, access to cheap African uranium had allowed French companies to underbid competitors for international nuclear contracts. With uranium costs rising to market levels, French nuclear exports became less competitive against American, Russian, and South Korean alternatives. The strategic implications were profound. France's nuclear industry faced potential collapse. The psychological impact on French foreign policy was equally significant. For generations, French presidents had used African relationships to project global influence and maintain France's status as a major power. The Niger crisis revealed the fragility of these relationships and the limitations of French power in a multipolar world. Macron's government faced difficult questions about France's role in international affairs. The successful conclusion of the Niger nuclear deal emboldened Russian diplomacy across Africa. Putin's representatives began offering similar partnerships to resource-rich countries throughout the continent. Zambia received proposals for copper mining cooperation. The Democratic Republic of Congo was offered cobalt processing technology, and South Africa was invited to join Russian nuclear energy programs. The template established in Niger was being replicated across the continent. As 2023 drew to a close, the full scope of Putin's African strategy became apparent. Russia wasn't simply seeking to replace Western influence with Russian control. They were offering a fundamentally different model of international partnership based on mutual respect and shared benefits. This approach resonated powerfully with African leaders tired of condescending Western attitudes and exploitative economic relationships. The Niger nuclear deal had opened a new chapter in global geopolitics. The situation escalated dramatically when French intelligence intercepted communications between Russian nuclear experts and Niger's new military leadership. The conversations revealed plans far more ambitious than anyone in Paris had imagined. Russia wasn't just seeking to replace France as Niger's uranium buyer. They were planning to build a complete nuclear fuel cycle facility in West Africa, transforming the region into a major player in global nuclear markets. Dr. Sergei Kirienko, head of Russia's state nuclear corporation Rosatom, arrived in Niamey with a team of 50 engineers and scientists. Their mission was to conduct feasibility studies for what would become Africa's most advanced nuclear facility. The proposed complex would include uranium mining, processing, enrichment, and fuel fabrication capabilities. For the first time in African history, a nation would control its entire nuclear supply chain from extraction to finished fuel rods. The strategic implications were staggering. France's nuclear industry had always depended on importing raw uranium from Africa and processing it in European facilities. This arrangement kept African nations dependent while concentrating high-value activities in Europe. Russia's proposal would reverse this colonial model, creating thousands of skilled jobs in Niger while reducing European advantages in nuclear technology. Emmanuel Macron realized that France was facing an existential crisis. His advisors calculated that losing Niger's uranium would cost French taxpayers approximately 15 billion euros annually in higher energy costs. The French nuclear fleet, consisting of 56 reactors, would need expensive modifications to use uranium from alternative sources. Some older reactors might need to be shut down entirely, forcing France to import electricity from neighboring countries. The French president decided on a desperate gambit. He personally called several African leaders, offering unprecedented concessions to prevent further defections to Russia. Senegal's President Macky Sall received promises of debt forgiveness and increased development aid. Ivory Coast's Alassane Ouattara was offered preferential trade agreements and military support. The conversations revealed French panic and African leaders' growing confidence in negotiating better terms. However, these last-minute French overtures came too late and seemed too calculating. African leaders had watched France's response to the Niger crisis with keen interest. The immediate suspension of aid and threats of military intervention confirmed their worst suspicions about French attitudes toward African sovereignty. Russia's respectful approach and generous terms stood in stark contrast to French ultimatums and conditional assistance. Meanwhile, in Niger's uranium-rich Arlit region, French mining operations ground to a halt. Local workers, inspired by the new government's nationalist rhetoric, staged strikes demanding better wages and working conditions. French managers found themselves isolated and increasingly unwelcome in communities they had exploited for decades. The psychological shift was as important as the political one. Nigerians were no longer willing to accept second-class treatment in their own country. Russian technicians began arriving in Arlit to assess the mining infrastructure. Their preliminary reports identified significant opportunities for improving extraction efficiency and reducing environmental damage. The French had operated with minimal regard for ecological consequences, leaving behind contaminated water sources and degraded land. Russia promised to implement modern, cleaner mining techniques that would benefit local communities. The geopolitical chess game intensified when China announced interest in investing in Niger's nuclear sector. Beijing offered to finance infrastructure development connecting Niger's mines to ports in Ghana and Benin, reducing dependence on French-controlled transportation networks. The prospect of Chinese-Russian cooperation in West Africa sent alarm bells ringing throughout Western capitals. President Joe Biden's administration found itself caught between supporting French ally and avoiding the appearance of defending colonialism. American officials quietly encouraged France to negotiate more equitable arrangements with African partners, while publicly condemning military coups. The delicate balancing act satisfied neither French demands for strong support nor African expectations for American neutrality. The human dimension of the crisis became increasingly visible as French expatriates began evacuating Niger. Families who had lived comfortably in Niamey for generations found themselves unwelcome overnight. The French Cultural Center closed, French schools suspended operations, and Air France canceled flights to the capital. The end of an era was becoming tangible for ordinary people on both sides of the relationship. Russian cultural presence quickly filled the void left by departing French institutions. Russian language courses were established in Niamey's universities. Russian films were shown in local cinemas, and Russian musicians performed at cultural festivals. The soft power component of Putin's African strategy was as important as economic and military cooperation. Russia was winning hearts and minds through cultural engagement, not just resource deals. The military dimension of Russian involvement remained carefully calibrated to avoid provoking Western intervention. Wagner Group advisors worked discreetly with Nigerian forces, focusing on training and equipment rather than direct combat operations. Their expertise in unconventional warfare and counterterrorism proved valuable in addressing jihadist threats that French forces had failed to eliminate. European energy markets began reflecting the reality of France's uranium supply crisis. Electricity futures prices across Europe spiked as traders anticipated reduced French nuclear exports. Germany, already struggling with energy security following the Ukraine conflict, faced the prospect of supporting French power imports instead of receiving them. The ripple effects of Putin's African strategy were spreading throughout European integration. The preliminary nuclear cooperation agreement between Russia and Niger evolved into a comprehensive, strategic partnership covering multiple sectors. Beyond uranium mining and nuclear technology, the deal included agricultural cooperation, telecommunications infrastructure, and military assistance. Russia was offering Niger everything France had withheld: technology transfer, fair prices, and respect for sovereignty. Colonel Chiani's military government used the Russian partnership to legitimize its rule and build popular support. Public rallies in Niamey drew thousands of supporters celebrating Niger's second independence from French colonialism. Russian flags appeared alongside Nigerian ones at these events, symbolizing the new partnership. The psychological impact was profound. Nigerians finally felt like equal partners in international relationships. The domino effect across West Africa accelerated as neighboring countries watched Niger's successful defiance of France. Mali's military government announced it was reviewing all mining contracts with French companies. Burkina Faso's leaders began exploring alternative partnerships for their gold exports. Guinea's junta started negotiations with Russian aluminum companies to replace French firms. The French Empire in Africa was crumbling in real time. Financial markets reflected the changing reality, as shares in French nuclear and mining companies continued falling. Orano's stock price lost 40% of its value within 3 months of the Niger coup. EDF, France's state-owned electricity company, faced credit downgrades as analysts questioned the company's ability to maintain nuclear operations without cheap African uranium. The economic foundation of French energy independence was dissolving. Putin's masterstroke was becoming apparent to observers worldwide. By offering genuine partnership instead of exploitation, Russia was systematically dismantling French influence across Africa while securing access to critical resources for its own economy. The Niger nuclear deal represented just the beginning of a broader transformation that would reshape global power dynamics for decades to come. The winter of 2023 brought unprecedented energy challenges to France as the reality of losing Niger's uranium supplies hit home. Electricity prices soared to historic levels, forcing millions of French families to choose between heating their homes and other essential expenses. The government implemented emergency energy rationing measures, with rolling blackouts affecting industrial areas during peak demand periods. The country that had once exported nuclear electricity to half of Europe now struggled to meet its own energy needs. President Macron faced mounting pressure from all directions. Street protests erupted in major cities as citizens demonstrated against skyrocketing energy costs. Industrial leaders threatened to relocate their operations to countries with more stable electricity supplies. The opposition parties seized on the crisis to attack Macron's foreign policy failures, with Marine Le Pen organizing massive rallies calling for immediate negotiations with Niger's military government to restore uranium supplies. The human suffering extended beyond France's borders as the energy crisis rippled through European markets. Hospitals in France postponed non-essential procedures to reduce electricity consumption. Schools shortened their heating hours, forcing children to wear winter coats in classrooms. Elderly citizens died from hypothermia, as they couldn't afford the dramatically increased heating costs. The social fabric of French society began fraying under the pressure of energy poverty. Meanwhile, in Niger, the transformation was remarkable and visible. The first Russian-built uranium processing facility was nearing completion, its modern design contrasting sharply with the colonial-era French installations. Hundreds of young Nigerians worked alongside Russian engineers, learning advanced nuclear technology that would ensure their country's energy independence for generations. The facility's environmental protections exceeded international standards, addressing decades of ecological damage from French mining operations. The Russian educational program was producing equally impressive results. The first group of Nigerian students in Moscow sent back reports of world-class training in nuclear physics, engineering, and reactor design. Their enthusiasm was infectious, inspiring thousands more young Africans to apply for Russian scholarships. These students would return home as the foundation of Niger's emerging nuclear industry, capable of operating sophisticated facilities without foreign dependence. Vladimir Putin made his first presidential visit to Africa in December 2023, choosing Niger as his primary destination. The symbolism was unmistakable. Russia's leader was treating an African nation as worthy of the highest-level diplomatic attention. Putin's arrival in Niamey drew massive crowds of supporters waving Russian flags and chanting pro-Russian slogans. The contrast with typical French presidential visits, which were usually brief and conducted with heavy security, was stark and intentional. During his address to Niger's parliament, Putin outlined Russia's vision for African partnership in the 21st century. He spoke of technological cooperation, fair resource pricing, and respect for sovereignty. Most importantly, he announced that Russia would share its nuclear technology freely with African partners, helping them develop their own nuclear industries rather than remaining dependent on foreign suppliers. The speech was broadcast across Africa and received enthusiastic responses from leaders throughout the continent. The French response to Putin's African tour was desperate and counterproductive. Macron dispatched diplomatic missions to neighboring countries, offering increased aid packages in exchange for continued loyalty. However, these last-minute concessions appeared calculated and insincere compared to Russia's long-term commitment to genuine partnership. African leaders had already seen how France treated allies who dared to assert their independence. The military dimension of the crisis escalated when France attempted to maintain its bases in neighboring countries despite growing hostility. French troops in Chad faced regular protests demanding their departure. In Burkina Faso, French military advisors were confined to their bases as local commanders refused to cooperate with their former colonial masters. The French military presence in West Africa, once a symbol of power, had become a liability. Russian military assistance proved far more effective and welcomed than French interventions. Wagner Group advisors helped Niger's army eliminate several jihadist strongholds that had existed for years under French protection. The success of these operations demonstrated that effective security cooperation was possible without the patronizing attitudes that characterized French military relationships. Other African countries took note of these successes. The economic dimensions of the Niger nuclear deal continued expanding throughout 2024. Russia's Rosatom announced plans to build small modular reactors in Niger, providing clean electricity for domestic use and export to neighboring countries. This would make Niger a regional energy hub, earning foreign currency from electricity sales rather than raw material exports. The transformation from resource exporter to value-added producer represented everything France had prevented for decades. The technological spillovers from Russian cooperation extended beyond nuclear energy. Russian companies began investing in Niger's telecommunications infrastructure, establishing 5G networks and satellite communication systems. Russian agricultural experts introduced modern farming techniques that increased crop yields dramatically. The comprehensive nature of Russian partnership contrasted sharply with France's narrow focus on resource extraction. The psychological impact on French society was profound as citizens realized their country's decline in global influence. Opinion polls showed plummeting confidence in French foreign policy and growing awareness of the country's colonial legacy. Young French people, facing economic hardship due to energy costs, began questioning why their government had maintained exploitative relationships with Africa rather than building genuine partnerships. The European Union struggled to respond effectively to Russia's African successes. Some members advocated for military intervention to restore French access to Niger's uranium, but others warned against appearing to defend colonialism. The division paralyzed European decision-making and allowed Russia to consolidate its gains across West Africa. The failure of European unity in this crisis exposed fundamental weaknesses in the Union's foreign policy. Coordination. China's role in supporting Russian-African strategy became more visible as infrastructure projects connected Russian-controlled resources to Chinese finance transportation networks. The Belt and Road Initiative integrated seamlessly with Russian resource partnerships, creating alternative trade routes that bypassed traditional Western-controlled systems. This Sino-Russian cooperation in Africa represented a fundamental challenge to Western economic dominance. The success of the Niger model inspired similar developments across Africa. Mali signed a comprehensive mining agreement with Russian companies, replacing French firms that had operated there for decades. Burkina Faso negotiated technology transfer deals for gold processing facilities. Guinea restructured its bauxite exports to favor Russian aluminum companies over French competitors. The domino effect was accelerating across the continent. The French nuclear industry faced existential challenges as uranium costs continued rising and alternative suppliers demanded long-term contracts at market prices. Several older French reactors were scheduled for early retirement as they became uneconomical to operate. The country that had built its energy independence on cheap African resources now faced the prospect of depending on expensive imports from Australia, Kazakhstan, and Canada. The social tensions within France intensified as winter deepened and energy costs remained high. Yellow Vest protests resumed with renewed intensity, focusing on energy poverty and foreign policy failures. The government's approval ratings plummeted to historic lows as citizens blamed Macron's administration for the loss of Niger's uranium. The political stability of the French Republic itself began to appear uncertain. As 2024 progressed, the full scope of Putin's victory in Africa became undeniable. Russia had successfully displaced France as the dominant foreign power in West Africa, while securing access to critical resources for its own.